Good afternoon. My name is Damian Sojourner, Associate Professor of Anthropology at UC Irvine. On behalf of the Black Reconstruction as a Portal Collective, Marilyn Grail-Brisk, Timmy Famadou, Mario Rowland, and Yusuf Al-Balushi, I extend an enthusiastic welcome to our seminar entitled The Wake Up: Social Reproduction, Prison, Pacification, and the Abolitionist General Strike. A huge thank you to Amanda Swain and Akua Aaron from the UC Irvine Humanities Center, and also our sincere appreciation to Melissa Valdez and Monica Rodriguez from the Department of Anthropology for providing a multifaceted range of support for today's seminar. The Wake Up is a lecture and discussion led by my comrade, colleague, and co-conspirator, Dr. Orisanmi Burton, whose work has been very influential, not only in my own thinking and writing, but has greatly shaped the contours of what is an ever-growing field of what can best perhaps be described as anti-prison study. Orisanmi Burton is an assistant professor of anthropology at American University. His research employs innovative ethnographic and archival methods to examine historical collisions between Black radical organizations and state repression in the United States. Dr. Burton's work has been published in North American Dialogue, The Black Scholar, American Anthropologist, among other outlets, and has received support from the Winogrand Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University, and the Margaret Casey Foundation, which selected him as the 2021 Freedom Scholar. Dr. Burton's first book, which I'm super excited about, and everybody should pre-order it today, entitled Tip of the Spear: Black Radicalism, Prison Repression, and the Long Attica Revolt, will be published by the University of California Press in October later of this year, 2023. Following Dr. Burton's talk, we will convene a discussion where your questions can be written into the chat. And without further ado, Dr. Orisanmi Burton.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much, Damian, for the generous introduction. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you to the organizers of the Sawyer Seminar series, and thank you all who are watching for choosing to spend your time with me, as that is our most valuable resource. So let me share my screen so we can get this going. So as Damian noted, my forthcoming book is entitled Tip of the Spear, and it's about Black radical and revolutionary politics and state repression within, against, and through prisons in New York State and beyond. And Attica is really the point around which the story revolves. And I'm thinking about Attica differently than previous studies have. I talk about what I call the Long Attica Revolt, in which Attica functions as a metonym for a temporally protracted and geographically dispersed struggle for Black liberation against the carceral world. Not just the physical brick and mortar prison, but the social order that requires the prison and that operates through a carceral logic, even when no walls or bars are visible. In 1971, Attica becomes the center of the struggle, but it was a struggle that involved an expanding network of prisons across New York State and beyond. So what you're looking at here is a poster produced by Akil Al-Jundi, an Attica brother who continued to organize upon his release from prison, and also developed by Laura Whitehorn, a former member of the Weather Underground who co-founded an organization called Release Aging People in Prisons, which is operational today and which you all should check out. It's otherwise known as RAP. You can see that they're clearly situating Attica within a broader genealogy of anti-carceral rebellion, right? The list to the left in white are other prison rebellions that had occurred during the same era, but they're also connecting Attica to global anti-colonial struggle, as you can see in the text below in green. And so my work is taking this form of analysis seriously, pursuing the question of Attica's revolutionary politics and examining the state response to it as counterinsurgency, ultimately arguing that the prison system of today functions as it does because it is an institutionalized form of counter-revolutionary warfare masquerading as a crime control apparatus. So there's a lot that can be said there, and I say it as best I can in the book. This talk focuses on a very narrow aspect of the Long Attica Revolt and what I call prison pacification, and that is labor, how incarcerated people were striving to understand the function of labor within the overall prison system, how they were experimenting with ways to withdraw their labor in an effort to disrupt and abolish the system. And it also looks at how the state was constantly innovating new ways to consume captive labor, to feed on it like a parasite in order to reproduce and expand itself. So because I won't be making a lot of explicit references to Dubois or Black Reconstruction throughout the presentation, I want to just begin by laying out some of the key themes in Black Reconstruction that are influential to my research, in the hopes that as I move through the presentation, those resonances will be evident. So the first one is that Du Bois argues that slavery didn't end with the Civil War, and that in the wake of the regime's formal abolition, that is slavery, white racists engaged in guerrilla warfare through the KKK. And he talks about the ongoingness of slavery and its perpetuation through a white supremacist form of guerrilla warfare. And this is useful for my work, which looks to thinks through the under-theorized and under-historicized nexus between war, slavery, and prisons. Du Bois also narrates a working class struggle that is fractured by the color line, and he examines how racial solidarities are ruptured by class position. And so I'm looking at similar dynamics here with added layers of division that spring from the prison wall itself and from technologies of criminalization. His is also approach which sees Black people as agents and strategists of physical, political, and intellectual warfare. It's an internationalist approach that situates Black struggle in the United States within a global context. And there's also an interesting theme, which is Du Bois's attentiveness to what I would call information warfare. That is, throughout the book, he's constantly analyzing propaganda, subterfuge, secret organizations and societies and conspiracies, and all of this is central to my work. So that's my introduction. What comes next is divided into 4 parts. Some of what's you'll hear in part 1 will also be in the book, but the content of most of this talk didn't make it into the book. So this is mostly new material, and I'm really thankful for the opportunity to work through it with you all. So part 1, the abolitionist general strike. So this is obviously another reference to Black Reconstruction. And to be clear, I'm employing multiple meanings of the word strike here, as both the withdrawal of labor and its exertion in the form of an attack or an assault against the carceral state formation under conditions of undeclared war. These strikes emerged behind the walls of particular prisons, but what I'm trying to show is the efforts of incarcerated laborers, organizers, and combatants to generalize this strike, that is, to build solidarity across various lines of division, including the physical boundary that is the prison wall, and to nurture a revolutionary abolitionist movement. And this was extremely difficult. As members of an Auburn prison chapter of a group called the People's Party explained in 1972, before Attica, most of the parties on the left would not even grant a prisoner membership. Communists in the prisons learned to rely on their own strengths, fighting battle after battle. And now that we hear all of you saying, right on, we remember back to the time when certain communists said that Attica was cool, since it would save them the trouble of liquidating the lumpen after a victorious socialist revolution. So here we see a comprehension on the part of incarcerated Black radicals of the contempt in which they were held by fractions of the left and of the white working class in particular, because they were Black, because they were from the lumpen class, which Marx and Engels called social scum that are easily instrumentalized by capitalists, and because they're in prison. Relying on their own strength, as well as the political and affective labor of their support networks beyond the walls, captives ruptured their incarceration through an intensifying series of strikes. So part 1 of the book looks at the New York City jail rebellion of 1970, the Auburn rebellion of 1970 to 1971, and the Attica rebellion of 1971, arguing that this is part of one long revolt, which lasted for at least 13 months, but in fact endured for years after its officially declared end. As the revolt was unfolding, Black radicals were sharpening their analysis of how prison labor was being exploited and how incarcerated people could weaponize their labor as part of a broader effort to abolish the system. So, for example, during the New York City jail rebellion of 1970, Black Liberation Army Zaid Malik Shakur wrote, "We say that prisoners themselves can do away with the prison system. In order for prisons to exist, it actually entails the participation of the inmates. They are responsible for running the prisons with the exception of being guards and wardens. They take care of all the administrative work, the cooking, the cleaning, they make the shoes, they upkeep the grounds. If the guards came to them one day and said, 'All right, come out of your cell,' for a head count, and they refused, then the penal society in this country would collapse." So this is an early articulation of what carceral studies scholars like Craig Gilmore, Ruthie Gilmore, and James Kilgore and others have argued that prison labor is primarily reproductive, that its primary function is to cut the cost of running the system, not to generate profits for private corporations. Although that does happen in many instances, this profit motive is not what drives the system. So in sections 3 and 4 of the talk, I'm going to offer what I think is a paradigmatic example of how prison labor functions as reproductive labor and how incarcerated people try to weaponize it. For now, here's another example. What you're looking at is archival footage of an incarcerated man named Dusty picking apples in an orchard near Attica prison during the 1980s. These apples will later be served to incarcerated people in Attica and other prisons as a way to keep the cost of feeding them as low as possible. So as Shakur's analysis indicates, by 1970, incarcerated people had grown increasingly interested in quantifying the value of their exploited labor, especially through core crafts, New York's prison industries program, and in fact, the oldest prison industries program in the nation, where captive laborers were producing commodities for use by the prison system and other state agencies. For 2 days in July of 1970, 450 laborers went on strike in Attica's metal shop. This is more than a year before the rebellion. The metal shop was an ultra-repressive site where overwhelmingly Black workers constructed shelving, lockers, cabinets, and tables for between 6 to 29 cents per day. The action yielded mixed results. Prison crats instituted a system-wide hike in wages to between 25 cents to $1 a day. However, according to Martin Sostra, an imprisoned revolutionary, this increase was canceled out by a simultaneous increase in commissary prices. Some of the principal organizers of that strike were transferred to Auburn, home to a bed shop, a furniture shop, a tobacco packing plant, and a plate shop, which produced license plates and highway signs for most of the state. 4 months later, on November 2nd, 1970, the same day that incarcerated people in California's Folsom prison launched a strike to pressure the authorities to meet their manifesto of demands, a manifesto which would later be revised and reissued in Attica, incarcerated Black Panthers, Young Lords, and Five Percenters withheld their labor from Auburn's prison industry, educational, and vocational programs, forcing the warden to declare a half holiday. The Auburn action was carried out in observance of Black Solidarity Day, a Black nationalist holiday established in 1969 by a professor named Carlos Russell. It encouraged Black communities across the United States to stay home from their schools and workplaces on November 2nd in order to gather, strategize, and organize collectively. The idea was inspired by Douglas Turner Ward's Day of Absence, a 1965 play about a fictional Southern town that experiences a crisis after its Black population suddenly disappears. In other words, this Black Solidarity Day action and the Folsom strike in California were part of this deeper cultural imaginary regarding the general strike. Ultimately, over 1,000 people did not work in Auburn that day. Instead, they gathered in the yard, delivered speeches, and held study groups. Similar actions took place or were planned in Comstock, Clinton, Sing Sing, and other prisons in New York. And at the same time that this was happening, an estimated 8,000 people belonging to various Black organizations gathered in Manhattan Center to observe Black Solidarity Day in the quote unquote free world. So these actions were happening inside and outside simultaneously, and incarcerated people were trying to formalize and tighten the coordination between the inside and outside. So here's a handwritten press release authored by Black Panther political prisoner Eddie Ellis and mailed to Black Arts Movement poet Larry Neal, where Ellis is trying to heighten the consciousness of what's happening in Auburn and to build that coordination. The following night, Auburn's warden retaliated by isolating 12 of the so-called ringleaders of the Auburn strike in solitary confinement. Captives responded by seizing hostages, inaugurating a period of guerrilla warfare that persisted for 6 months. Prison crats subjected those responsible to unfathomable trauma and transferred them elsewhere, including Greenhaven Prison, which later became a critical site of labor organizing. At its height in 1972, the Greenhaven Union had approximately 1,800 members, virtually the entire population of the prison, and it received formal affiliation with District 65 Distributive Workers of America, an outside union boasting 30,000 members. And the union had the potential to bring outside organizers into the prison. However, that effort received a major blow when New York's Public Employees Relations Board decided that incarcerated workers in Greenhaven and elsewhere in the state were not eligible for protections afforded to other state employees. As the Greenhaven struggle was unfolding, dozens of transferees from Auburn were sent to Attica, where on September 9th, 1971, they joined nearly 1,300 captives in a collective rebellion. Although the event is rarely theorized as a strike, it is critical to understand that through rebellion, incarcerated people withdrew their labor from the carceral regime and redirected it toward the construction of what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls abolition geography. Archived video surveillance, supposed to be playing, it's not, but you can take my word for it. Archived video surveillance footage of occupied D Yard offers a glimpse of the collective labor the rebels poured into this geography in order to transform it and themselves into something new. As the camera frame pans across the densely populated yard, the voice of a state trooper can be heard over the pervasive sounds of hammers driving nails into wood. With a sense of utter bewilderment, he says, quote, "They seem to be building as much as they're destroying." So this was an abolitionist general strike, and the rebels told us this through their collectively authored Declaration to the People of America. We have set forth demands that will bring closer to reality the demise of these prisons, institutions that serve no useful function to the people of America, but to those who would enslave and exploit the people of America. Part 2, prison pacification. So I argue that the state's assault on Attica, as terrible and genocidal as it was only the opening salvo in a protracted project of prison pacification. I use that term to describe a campaign of racist and political repression, white supremacist science and technology, and organized violence advanced by a network of actors variously located within penal hierarchies, police agencies, foreign theaters of war, counterinsurgency think tanks, universities, the FBI, and the CIA. New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller was a central figure in this campaign, not only because he authorized the massacre, which ended the lives of at least 29 rebels and 10 prison guards, but also because his counterinsurgent statecraft was responsible for institutionalizing a range of repressive techniques in the massacre's wake. Explorations of Rockefeller's role in forging the carceral state have largely focused on the passage of the so-called Rockefeller drug laws in 1973. However, in addition to inaugurating the war on drugs, which was really a war through drugs, Rockefeller signed a law that enabled prison expansion to be financed via bond issues, while at the same time circumventing the need for voter approval, which normally preceded the accumulation of public debt. And this was central to the counterinsurgency project, as I will describe. Applying a method he used to construct the Empire State Plaza in Albany during the 1960s, Rockefeller built new prisons and renovated existing ones using the Public Benefit Corporation, or a PBC, an entity designed to provide flexible access to state power and capital while partially avoiding both government regulation and the risks of the market. The 1972 law empowered a PBC called the State Dormitory Authority to issue up to $50 million in debt to finance prison construction and renovation, a cap that was later lifted. It then gave another PBC, the Health and Mental Hygiene Facilities Improvement Corporation, responsibility for planning, designing, acquiring, and constructing prisons. Under the plan, DOCS, the state prison agency, would continue to run the new prisons, but the Mental Hygiene Facilities Improvement Corporation would hold the titles, at least until DOCS paid off the debt. On its face, the law included a mechanism for balancing the books, prison labor. Since 1953, New York's captive laborers had been remunerated with resources drawn from the Correctional Industry Fund, which accumulated revenues generated from selling the products of their labor. After the passage of this law, state taxpayers started footing the bill for the captives' meager wages, freeing up revenue generated by prison labor to service the PBC's debt. However, according to an annual report from Auburn's prison industry program, the most productive such program in the prison system, sales generated revenue barely exceeding $1 million in 1969. If all 12 of the state's major adult prisons pulled in similar numbers, which they didn't, their combined revenue would amount to a mere fraction of the dormitory authority's debt cap. Thus, the reformed use of prison labor and the Correction Industry Fund was an act of propaganda designed to suggest that the impending carceral boom would be financed through fiscally responsible means, when in fact, it was to be financed through an undemocratic process that would expand the state's debt. Geographer Jack Norton has done important research into how this mechanism was used by Governor Andrew Cuomo in the 1980s and 90s to build 29 prisons during his tenure. But what I'm interested in here is the dynamic between prison expansion and Black rebellion. And I'm arguing that prison expansion needs to be understood as a form of counterinsurgency. In the wake of Attica, Rockefeller established an entity called the Select Committee for Correctional Institutions and Programs, which aimed to build bipartisan support for his prison reform agenda, which was really a counterinsurgency agenda. And of course, he didn't openly use that term, nor the term pacification, to my knowledge. Instead, he and the committee called it modernization. But if we attend to the critical histories of modernization theory, we see that modernization projects were developed by US-based technocrats to counter communist insurgency. The Select Committee advocated for the construction of more prisons after Attica. In its second report, it offers an explicitly counterinsurgent rationale for this project. Citing the American Correctional Association's recently published Riot Control Manual, the committee notes, quote, "One of the most desirable and effective methods available is for the system to have a multiplicity of facilities for the difficult agitators," end quote. Elsewhere, the ACA manual notes that critical masses of intelligent and politically radical prisoners should never be concentrated in a single institution. And this is significant because in 1973, a high-level New York prison administrator attributed the Auburn Rebellion to a critical mass of revolutionaries that were concentrated there. So the political aspect of expansion sought to deconcentrate revolutionaries, to disaggregate them, to disperse them, to spread undesirable assemblages of different personality types across a wider geographic area, and to increase the number of walls dividing them from each other and from their support networks, and in doing so, to attenuate the potential for future rebellions. Expansion also had an economic side that aimed to strengthen support for prison development among rural, white, working class communities whose survival depended upon the availability of these unionized jobs that were created by expansion. So said Prison Commissioner Russell G. Oswald in the wake of Attica and the expansion project. Quote, "The plan provides necessary levels of custody and security to safeguard the public, staff, and inmates, and maintains the economic integrity and stability in communities and surrounding areas where these facilities have long been a positive factor for employment and economic stability." My point here is that any explanation for so-called mass incarceration or the expansion of the carceral state is incomplete if it does not account for the dynamism of Black rebellion within prisons themselves. So I'm fundamentally in agreement with Ruth Wilson Gilmore's macro analysis of prisons as a solution to capitalism in crisis, but I'm also arguing that this solution created the conditions for a new problem, the intensification of Black rebellion within prisons, and that prison expansion was indispensable to the solution of that problem. And moreover, that the people who developed and implemented the solution did so through a rubric of counterinsurgency. Part 3, assembly required. So we're going to jump ahead to the 1990s, the mid-90s, a moment in when Democratic President Bill Clinton intensified an ongoing trajectory of neoliberal restructuring set in motion by the Reagan counter-revolution. In 1996, making good on his campaign promise to end welfare as we know it, he ratified the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunities Reconciliation Act of 1996. He signed the North American Free Trade Agreement. And in 1994, with the help of then Senator Joe Biden, he signed the 1994 crime bill, which contained, among other things, a truth in sentencing provision, which authorized the federal government to provide grants to states for prison construction if those states promised to curb parole, holding those convicted of criminalized acts deemed violent for at least 85% of their sentences. While aggressive broken windows policing tactics ensured that a steady flow of surplus population would always be fed into prisons, the crime bill made it much harder for them to get out via parole. And not only did these tactics of race and class war guarantee that prisons would continue to swell with economically dispossessed, mostly Black and Latinx people, it provided states like New York with the capital necessary to build the infrastructure required to grow with the population. In doing so, the state provided an avenue of employment for white workers, the primary inhabitants of the deindustrialized rural geographies where most prisons were built. Making this point clear, George Pataki, whose very first act as New York governor in the 90s was to reinstate the death penalty, stressed the need to expand. As more violent offenders received longer sentences under my 1995 Sentencing Reform Act and Jenna's Law, another sentencing reform, the prison system needs more cells to lock up these violent offenders, and further sentencing reforms, which I have proposed, ensure that these cells will indeed be occupied and our prison employees will indeed be safe and secure. In exchange for his draconian reforms, the federal government gave New York just under $200 million in expansion funds between 1996 and 2000. And to be clear, Pataki, like Andrew Cuomo before him, is following the playbook established by the Rockefeller administration, referring to the importance of prison growth for achieving security in a dual sense. Security from the racialized specter of crime, violence, and rebellion, and economic security for the rural white working class who depended on prisons for their survival. These two types of security are inextricably linked through the prison in the post-Attica context, and this explains why Cuomo and Pataki collectively built nearly 40 prisons between 1983 and 2003, all of which were sited in rural areas of the state. During the same period, the state's captive population exploded from 28,500, double what it was a decade earlier when Attica erupted, to more than 71,000 at its peak in 1999. During the closing years of the 20th century, Pataki exploited incarcerated labor in a scheme to rapidly expand the prison system again, while keeping costs low. On August 4th, 1997, after the longest legislative session in state history, New York lawmakers approved a plan to construct a new 750-cell prison near the Adirondack Mountains. It also authorized construction of 8 100-cell units to be sited on the grounds of already existing medium security prisons, a cost-saving measure designed to take advantage of the staff and services that were already available at those sites. This project, constituted the largest single expansion since the construction of Attica prison 70 years earlier. Later, it was revealed that unlike the vast majority of cells in New York State, these new facilities were designed to confine 2 men to a cell. 2 men specifically. They were not implemented in women's prisons. A controversial practice in which strangers are forced to cohabitate a small cage for months and sometimes years. And this was criticized as an especially inhumane practice that made incarcerated people more vulnerable to various kinds of violence. But that wasn't the half of it. This new carceral capacity was designed as special housing units, sites of isolation, deprivation, and punishment for captives deemed incorrigible, political radicals, malcontents, and those experiencing mental health crises. In pairs, these captives were forced to spend at least 23 hours a day within a 105 square foot enclosure, outfitted with 2 beds stacked on top of each other, a combined toilet and sink unit, a desk with retractable stools, a slab of reflective stainless steel that functions as a mirror, and a curtainless shower that is controlled by a console officer stationed in a remote location. All meals were prepared by 300 cadre inmates who, that's a quote, who also inhabited the prison and were delivered through a feed slot in the door and consumed inside the cells. So there's the shower, there are the 2 bunks. The door you see there is the door that exits out into the recreation area, and those are called rec pens, also known as kennels, and it's just another cage where you get some semblance of fresh air and you can just kind of walk around for an hour each day. And these cages were designed with behavior modification in mind, drawing on a long history of CIA research into sensory deprivation and different control techniques. The S blocks, the name given to the add-ons that would be built on existing carceral sites, were slated to come online in 12 months from the budget announcement, while Upstate Correctional Facility, the name chosen for the standalone facility, was going to come online within 2 years. And this was an extremely fast turnaround made possible by new developments in modular prison construction. On July 17th, 1996, more than a year before the state budget was passed, the Office of General Services entered into a 3-year exclusive contract with Mark Solutions Incorporated. Established in 1986, the New Jersey-based company offered a novel product, mass-produced, prefabricated, customizable prison cells made out of steel rather than concrete. And this was a method that had been gaining steam since 1984, such that by 1989, Corrections Today magazine reported that the modular technology was surging into the forefront of prison construction. Compared to concrete cells constructed through traditional building techniques, prefabricated steel cells were cheaper to produce, lighter and easier to transport. They were highly customizable and could arrive fully furnished, such that all you needed to do was place them where you wanted them and then hook them up to the plumbing and electricity, and then that's it. In a write-up for the Chicago Tribune, Mark President Carl Coppola boasted that the company successfully adapted the simplicity of interlocking children's blocks to prison construction. According to the initial contract, which I got from the SEC, the Mark's SEC report, the Core Craft Prison Industry Program at Greenhaven was slated to receive shipments of complete, partially complete, and deconstructed modular units, totaling an estimated 2,455 cells over a 3-year period. And under the watchful eye of a structural engineer and a team of guards, Greenhaven's captive laborers were made to build these cells, after which Corecraft would then sell them back to the prison system at a profit. So this, and I gotta give a shout out again to Jack Norton, who found this image. So this history is extremely difficult to trace. The budget negotiations that resulted in the project were carried out largely in secret. Pataki refused to turn the records of his administration over to the New York State Archive. And I reached out to the structural engineer who I tracked down and who oversaw the building project, but he declined to talk to me about it. And then, as you can see here, docs responded to my FOIL request about this project, informing me that all records related to the project had been destroyed in accordance with minimum retention requirements. So there are massive silences in the archive, as there always are. So here you can see the shell of upstate prison. This is a supermax prison being built through this technique. And I just want to highlight before moving on to the last section that this was counterinsurgency statecraft in a couple of ways, at least 3 ways. First, as I've already described, greater carceral capacity allows for a broader distribution of the population, which in turn dilutes politically productive forms of tension, intimacy, political organization, and allows the state to disaggregate political organizers and malcontents. Second, SHU cells, special housing unit cells, which proliferated in the US in the wake of Attica, are specifically designed to counter rebellion. But lastly, is counterinsurgency because these programs were designed to stabilize and reproduce the carceral system by redirecting incarcerated people's capacity, intellectual, physical, affective, and otherwise. And this point was made during a 1995 hearing about potential cuts to the state prison budget, when David Stallone, a representative of more than 4,000 programmatic prison staff, drew an explicit connection between well-funded prison programs and a manageable population. He said, quote, "We cannot ignore the lessons of Attica without threatening public safety. Idle time creates a vacuum that is filled by inmates themselves, creating an opportunity for inmates to organize themselves." So we see that more than 2 days after its eruption, Attica remained a cautionary tale, compelling prisoncrats to view incarcerated people as subjects of risk who are always teetering on the verge of rebellion. All right, I know I'm running short on time. This is my 4th and final section, the wake up. The collaboration between Corecraft and Mark became a site of contestation as soon as it was introduced. I interviewed a man named Powerful, who was imprisoned in Greenhaven when the cell building project was announced. And he told me, quote, "We said, hell no. We're not building cells for ourselves, nor are we building cells for our kids." Here we see an awareness that prison expansion was an intergenerational project, and that these cells would eventually be used not only against them, but against future generations and likely against their own children. Powerful joined leaders of various organizations in entering a pact of collective resistance against the project. The pact authorized the use of violence against any captive that agreed to build cells. Some even infiltrated the program, getting themselves selected for the sole purpose of identifying collaborators who would then be subjected to retaliation. Indeed, several men were beaten, cut, and stabbed for participating in the project. Others were threatened that if they participated, their cells would be set on fire. This tactic is an example of what we might call unarmed vigilance, defined by Black studies scholar Akinyele Umoja as, quote, "the use of coercive force by a social movement to assert its authority among its constituency and community and to counter the loyalty its population may have for the dominant power structure." Prisoncrats were determined to carry out the project by any means. In response to the resistance, a DOCS spokesman told the press, quote, "You may have a philosophical difference in making license plates, but if you're an inmate in Auburn, you're going to be making license plates. And if you're an inmate in Greenhaven, you're going to be making cells." They conducted investigation into what they dubbed a terror campaign against the collaborators. All the so-called ringleaders of this action, along with anyone who was political or who had influence within the population, were written up on spurious disciplinary charges. One such captive, a man named Ismail Muhammad, later testified that a high-level prisoncrat told him, quote, "This order has come down from the top, the governor to the commissioner, that those S blocks are going to go online and those cells are going to be built in Greenhaven. And anyone who interferes with that is going to feel the wrath of the state," end quote. Weaponizing the system's expansive post-Attica infrastructure, prisoncrats transferred Muhammad and the other resistors to disparate prisons that were far from their support networks in urban centers and isolated them in the very solitary confinement cells that were being built and which the project sought to intensify. But banishing the most influential and politically conscious captives from Greenhaven did not quell resistance, and Docks was forced to adopt a new strategy. They identified qualified and willing participants from across the system in men's prisons, secretly transferred them to Greenhaven, and housed them in a separate wing of the prison. They shifted the cell shops hours to begin before the normal workday and to end after the general population had been locked in, ensuring that collaborators would not be identified on their way to or from the shifts. And they also obscured the window of the shop floor so that to maintain the anonymity of the workers. Coverage of the cell building project, it just didn't make the mainstream press, right? But by 1999, all nine of the S blocks were built. Actually, 9 of them were built, one greater than what was planned. Upstate was going to open in about 30 days, and they also started construction on another supermax prison called 5 Points using the same technology. But at the same time, Greenhaven captives had generalized a collective resistance nurtured in response to the cell building project into a plan for a simultaneous strike against all 71 New York State prisons. So this is Alice Green, director of the Albany-based Center for Law and Justice, who was central to me, doing the research to the project, and what was also central to the strike. The plan was surreptitiously announced during a December meeting of the Nation of Islam. According to Hidden Resistance and Repression, an account of the struggle provided to me by an imprisoned organizer named Absolute, who was in that meeting, the plan was for a massive work stoppage that would force the state to replace captive labor with free labor, dramatically raising the cost of running the prisons, thereby forcing prison crowds to negotiate with the strikers, who would then call for reforms to Pataki's draconian parole laws. Slated to commence with the start of the new millennium, the captives dubbed it Y2K. And some of you will remember the Y2K kerfuffle, let's call it, where people thought Western civilization might collapse because computers weren't programmed for the new millennium. And incarcerated people said, well, if everything else is going to shut down, then we're going to shut the prisons down too. And one of the primary organizing materials that they used was a document entitled Wake Up, which you can see pictured here in 3 different versions, all of which are designed to appear innocuous. It was authored by incarcerated people, smuggled out, retyped by allies on the other side of the walls, smuggled back in. And it critiques the states, it critiques the truth in sentencing laws, it critiques Pataki's parole laws, and it even talks about the work that had been done by a journalist named Gary Webb in his book Dark Alliance, where he traces the links between the Central Intelligence Agency and the flow of cocaine into prison, into the United States. And that book had just come out. The document argued that Docks was refusing to release people on parole because it had become a prison industrial complex or a prison industrial corporation. Those were their terms. Throughout the US, they wrote, prisons are being built in economically depressed regions to replace metal mills and manufacturing industries that relocated to Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean, seeking greater profits. That's their language. State actors like Cuomo and Pataki developed what they called a symbiotic relationship with the people of those northern rural regions, who continued to give them their votes as long as they continued to build prisons to keep them and their children employed. So they had an analysis of the global political economy and how class bisected racial solidarities, particularly whiteness, and the role of prison growth in stabilizing the capitalist mode of production amid deindustrialization. They wrote, why should we be the raw materials in Docks' prison industrial corporation, which only serves the interests of politicians to be elected into office and to provide jobs for rural northern New Yorkers? Why should we be warehoused in overcrowded conditions, sleeping one on top of each other in double bunks? Why should we work to maintain the prisons as porters, cooks, plumbers, masons, welders, tailors, roofers, painters, tutors, facilitators, prisoners, landscapers, farmers, glaziers, carpenters, electricians, musicians, artists, mechanics, opticians, drivers, instructors, or in any capacity necessary to keep docks, prison, corporation functioning properly. And they declared their intention to wage a strike on January 1st, 2000. And they circulated this document everywhere. In preparation for the strike, captives started to do different kinds of what they called solidarity practices, solidarity exercises, getting them ready for the repression that they knew was coming. Ultimately, several of the organizers were discovered and again shipped to the solitary confinement capacity that was under construction. And I don't have good numbers, but it seems like anywhere from 500 to 800 people throughout the system were preemptively isolated. And so the strike never actually materialized. It was never fully actualized. But I think we need to think about the intent of the strike, the organizing of the strike, the conditions under which it was being organized, and think about it in relation to like slave rebellions that weren't fully actualized, but which we still talk about, such as, you know, that organized by Denmark, Vesey, and others. So this is really a momentous moment, I think, in prison, in the history of prison organizing. And I'll just end by bringing us into the present with the national prison strikes of 2016 and 2018, which were not only explicitly organized to coincide with the assassination of George Jackson and the Attica Rebellion, these two key moments in the history of radical and revolutionary prison organizing, but which also were carried out based on this same critical analysis of prison labor. So some of the organizers of the strike, you know, they wrote essays. One of them is entitled "Let the Crops Rot in the Field," where they're explicitly analyzing their condition in relation to slavery and talking about the strategies of enslaved people who strategically withheld their labor in order to force plantocrats to pay a high price. And that was their strategy of resistance. And so, you know, what I tried to do here is sort of lay out a genealogy of this kind of hidden labor struggle, while also clarifying the role of labor, not only in the reproduction of the carceral state, but in the reproduction of Black radical and revolutionary politics. So I'll end there and just express my gratitude for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burton, for that very insightful talk and lecture. I'd like to remind everybody who's participating today that if you have a question, to please enter it into the Q&A function, and then be fielded by myself to Dr. Burton. So we have one question that's in the Q&A right now that comes from Samasa Boko. And Samasa writes, thank you for this precise, carefully, and theoretically innovative talk and project. Can you talk about the implications, that is at the level of theory, public consciousness, policy, et cetera, of understanding war, that is the concept of war, beyond the standard social scientific definition of which Samasa gives a quote of 1,000 battle deaths per year between two organized combatants. So this is sort of like this expansion of the common sense understanding of what war is, which you use both in your book, but specifically in the talk as well today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Samasa. Hopefully I pronounced your name right. This is one of those answers where I could just ramble on and on. So I'm trying to think of a productive way to answer it. I guess the one thing I'll say is that, you know, at a certain point in the research process, I realized that I wasn't actually studying prisons necessarily, that I was studying war, and that prisons were just the domain of war that I was looking at. It was the object of study, not the object of analysis. War was the object of analysis. And so once I realized that, I started to just really study war, both historically, but the specific regime of war, which the prison represents, which is sort of counter-revolutionary warfare, counterinsurgency, pacification, as carried out against struggles for national liberation globally. So I think that once you take the war analytic seriously, a whole set of questions and concerns open up, and several things become more clear. One of the things that I sort of allude to in the talk, but I try to lay out in detail in the book, is that it clarifies our understanding of reform and the function of reform. So if you study like counterinsurgency and pacification, the people who understand themselves to be theorists of that kind of warfare are very clear about the political function of reform under counterinsurgency. The political function of reform is to capture legitimacy among the majority of the population who it is believed can be bargained with, who it is believed are not really the radicals and revolutionaries who have to be dealt with in a different kind of way. So it captures that legitimacy, and in so doing, it isolates people who cannot be essentially bribed or bought off through reforms, and those people are assassinated or held in solitary confinement. And so my work looks at how people who were enacting prison reform in the wake of Attica thought about reform in that way, and explicitly enacted reforms for that purpose. And so I think it just sharpens our analysis of what we mean when we talk about reform. The other thing that the war analytic does is obviously it opens up and legitimizes a whole set of tactical concerns regarding the role of violence in political struggle. So there's that, obviously. And then lastly, and this is similar to the reform answer, I guess, but it changes the morality of struggle. It's harder to just say that a given action is good or bad under conditions of war, because there's a whole different set of ethics. And everything can be both a tool and a weapon in war. And so something that looks like a tactical victory can very quickly shift and be used against you. And like that's sort of the history of our struggle. And part of the reason that we, I think, the broad we, I mean, people who understand themselves to be on the left get tripped up, is because we don't think about war enough, but we're facing opponents that do think about war. And so there's an incommensurability there that I'm hoping my work will help to explode and eradicate. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And a reminder again to post questions that you have into the Q&A for Dr. Burton. So I have a question for you. Well, actually, let's before I go to my question, we have a couple questions that just came in. So question from Imani Kai Johnson, who asks, how did you come to this project?
Word, thank you, Imani. A long time ago, worked for an organization called the Prison Moratorium Project, not the California version, the New York version, which was co-founded by Eddie Ellis, who I mentioned in the talk, who was a member of the Harlem Black Panther Party, and was incarcerated and then was part of Attica. And to make a long story short, let's fast forward to when I started to do my dissertation research. And I had always been hearing scattered bits of folklore about how like the work we were doing at PMP was connected to Attica. And so, I was very much politicized through that work. And so I decided to do my dissertation research there. And the first person that I decided to interview was Eddie. And that turned out to be a 6-hour interview where he took 0 breaks and just like, we just went in for 6 hours. But when I listen back on those interviews, I cringe because I was asking the wrong questions, and he was very generously trying to redirect my thinking, because I was very much asking questions about the present, but he employed a Black radical pedagogy to say, look, the questions that you want answers to, you can't have answers to until you understand the historical trajectory which produced the present. And he said, look, one of the things that we've never been able to do, we as in the prison movement, was to demonstrate that our analysis of prisons are a better analysis than the dominant analysis that circulates. And he invited me to play that role. And he actually didn't tell me what that better analysis is. And a few weeks later, he passed away of cancer, so I never got to talk to him again. But that's what set me on the path. And I realized, so the question for me was, okay, well, what was the Black radical analysis of prisons that was circulating in 1970, this crucial pivot point for what becomes this massive carceral expansion? And then it was like, oh, it's war. That's all. Like, if you look at the archive at the time, like that's all they're talking about, and that's all their opponents are talking about, right? And so once I started to get more serious about thinking about war, I noticed this interesting thing, which is there's this prison struggle, and there are people who understand, there are people on the left who are part of the struggle, who understand themselves to be revolutionaries, and who are understood by the state to be revolutionaries. And all they're talking about is war. Then there's people on the right, people like Nelson Rockefeller, even though he was, a Democrat or whatever, he's still right wing he's talking about war. He's talking about counter-revolutionary warfare. So there's agreement on the left and the right about the fact that war is happening in 1970. The only people who don't agree with that are liberals who are talking about criminal justice. So part of what I did methodologically was like, okay, well, let me just take this war analysis seriously and follow it as deeply as I can go, take it as seriously as I can take it. And that, took me 9 years to write the book, but now I'm done and I'm grateful for being done. So that's how I got into it. And that's the short version, unfortunately.
All right, thank you for that. Next, we have a question from Madison Shoemaker, who writes, thank you for your presentation, Dr. Burton. I was wondering if you can go a bit more in depth about dealing with gaps in the archive. How do you follow leads to fill in these gaps? Are there certain situations where you just leave things alone, specifically within your research?
Right on. Thank you so much, Madison. I believe that's my student. So shout out to you. Thanks for showing up. So it depends. There's not one archive. There's multiple, like the archives are plural. And my analysis takes what I call the Black radical archive as the primary source. And then I use state archives to corroborate or to read them against the primary archive. But my point of departure and the sort of guide analytically and narratively are what Black radicals are doing and saying about this struggle. And so, there's different ways to deal with gaps. Sometimes you talk about the fact that there is a gap and talk about why that might be the case. Sometimes, and I do this in the book, I speculate, similar to what, Saidiya Hartman does in terms of critical fabulation, although I don't call it that, and I probably don't do it as well as she does it, but I try to do it anyway. So speculation, I think, which is absolutely necessary in this context, because the war is intensely asymmetrical and the state has outsized access to so many of these documents. I mean, this struggle is happening in prison where the state, quite often destroys records, kills people, destroys memory. And so they produce gaps. And so part of what we have to do is to sort of try to reconstruct what happens in those empty spaces. And we can't just allow the state archive to do that work for us because it's refracted through a white supremacist and patriarchal and elitist epistemology. So sometimes sometimes I just talk about the fact that there's a gap. Sometimes I speculate within the gap. And then often what I do is read the state archive and the Black Radical archive simultaneously against each other, not to say that they are on par with each other, because they're not. I've already said I privilege the Black Radical archive. But part of what happens when you read them against each other and you see like the profound differences in the different narratives that are produced, is that because I don't try to resolve those conflicts in the narratives. In fact, to the opposite, I highlight them as more evidence of what I'm calling war, but it's a war that's unfolding also on a narrative, archival, and an epistemic terrain. So, the last thing I'll say is, and this goes back to the previous question about war, is that, the effective conduct of war requires mobility and flexibility, and so too does its analysis. And so there's not one way to deal with the silence. It depends on the context. It depends on what is producing that silence. It depends on, what's happening in the narrative. But those are some of the ways that I deal with it.
Thank you again, and thank you for that great question and equally great response. Next, we have a question from Justin Hosby, we both know pretty well. And Justin asks, or first he states, brilliant talk analysis, Dr. Burton. And the question is, considering the spatial and place-bound implications of your work, New York figures prominently into this analysis of the carceral state. Is this largely because the Attica rebellion occurred in New York, or is there something unique and particular about New York that produced contradictions in the labor, capital, radical organizing that you analyze in this work? Thank you for your work.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, the question about New York. So Attica definitely exerts significant, because Attica took place in New York, so much of the key interventions, even if they were discussed or tested out elsewhere, are explicitly in response to Attica. So you're right for that. Like the framing of the question is solid for that reason. The other thing, hold on, I lost my train of thought. Let me get it back. Okay, the other thing is that California and New York, within the sort of prison administration circles, have always been viewed as being on the cutting edge of prison strategy and development. And we could speculate for why that is. I mean, in my book, I find that a lot of people who are based in Silicon Valley are brought in to do work in prisons. You've got a lot of the universities in both New York and in California, and a lot of those academics are being brought in to bring academic expertise into prisons. So there's that. New York and California were also hotbeds of various kinds of radical organizing, right? Thinking about, the social movements of the 1960s and 70s, which I argue was part of the impetus for why prisons had to reform and get better, to sort of capture and incarcerate that radicalism. So New York and California were key places there. You know, the high proportion of Black people and people of color in New York. In terms of the composition of labor in New York, that's not something I've thought about as much. So I'm not going to speculate on that right now. I think a person I've mentioned twice already, Jack Norton, might be a good person to think that through with. But it's an interesting question. And like I said, this is new work. The book doesn't have such a high focus on labor. And so I'm not sure if what I'm working on is part of another book or something else, but that's an important thing to think about. So thank you for that question, Justin.
All right. Thank you again, both for a great question and great response. Next, we have a question from Anna Dunsing, and I hope I am pronouncing that correctly. Anna writes, across Black Reconstruction, Du Bois is constantly thinking about and making reference to the revolutionary potential of his own 1930s moment in relation to his study of the 1860s through 1870s. Could you walk us through the longer arc timeline or points of reference / turning points you were thinking about in your own work? In other words, what other moments might we look to better understand these 1970 / 90s acts of resistance and uprising?
Yeah, thank you. Hmm. Well, I mean, I think about 1967 a lot, because that's the year that the counterintelligence program is revitalized. You know, it was established in 56 to target the Communist Party, revitalized in 67 to target essentially the New Left, but mostly the Black Left and the Black Panther Party. And that essentially was part of a broader project to incarcerate Black radical struggle. And so this was a solution to a political problem, which created the conditions for a new problem. I talked about this in the talk, which were these carceral rebellions. Another one is obviously Attica, which really marks a break. I mean, it's a rupture in the sense that there's a before Attica and an after Attica in the prison system. And I would argue that after Attica, the vast majority of reforms that happen in prisons, not only in New York and elsewhere, are carried out in service of preventing future Atticas from happening, which is to say, it's counterinsurgency. I mean, it's really the stuff that I talked about in the talk, right? The labor union that happened in Greenhaven was an opportunity that really could have shifted the balance of power among incarcerated laborers, but that was shot down in 1972. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I wonder if Anna has other thoughts about it. I'm having trouble thinking about it. I mean, because what I'm trying not to do is just go through like my whole argument. Yeah, but for me, it's like the main turning point is Attica. That's the main moment. You know, there's 67, there's Attica. And then what I'm trying to do is think about, you know, how the temporality of Attica is actually this long moment. So I'm actually not thinking about time in a linear fashion. And in fact, I start the book with the importance of thinking about time in different ways, because part of what this long Attica framework and this long pacification framework does is it disrupts how we might normally think about time and the sequential passage of events, and thinking about how these struggles are happening within this kind of structure of revolt that in many ways defies normative conceptions of time. So I guess I should have started with that. That's why I was kind of struggling to answer the question, because I think that in many ways Attica created a new, or the people who were struggling in the name of Attica were operating on a different sense of time, and of course are incarcerated outside of the normal flow of social life, and often incarcerated in sites of solitary confinement that are meant to destroy one's mooring in time and place. And so they're thinking about and using time in all of these different ways, which I don't fully understand, but try to honor in my attempt to write about them and narrate them and explain them and take them seriously.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much both for that question and your response, the time you took to go through it and your response. Next, we have a question from Jared Drake, who is also someone that we know as well. Jared asked, thank you for this engaging and important talk, Burton. That's how he foregrounds the question. You mentioned earlier that an elder gently redirected your focus when, as you said, you were not asking the right questions. I find both his redirection and your acceptance of it to be generative acts of intergenerational love. Can you elaborate on where, how, or even if love is situated in the theater of war and or in your project overall? Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. I talk about love in the book. I also talk about intimacy. I probably talk about intimacy more than love, but we could call it the affective domain of struggle. And it's absolutely essential. And here's why. I'm talking about a war, but it's an asymmetrical war, not only in terms of how the different sides of the war are, their capacities for violence and for organization, right? It's clearly asymmetrical in that way. But it's also asymmetrical in terms of the goal of the war, right? So, I mean, if you look at like state records, or if you if you let the FBI narrate the story, then like Black radicals who engage in rebellion are inaugurating a war. They're the warmongers. They're starting a war. They're initiating the violence, right? If you look at the Black radical archive, then those who rebel are rebelling against a war that has been ongoing since the establishment of the modern world, which they were born into. So even if it's offense, it's self-defense. So the sort of imperialist war that's ongoing and that has been ongoing for generations, the purpose of that war is to make the world safe for capitalism, to reproduce and to reproduce property relations, to make people exploitable for labor, to create extractive relationships. That's not the goal of the people who are engaging in this rebellion. The people who are engaging in this rebellion are trying to basically abolish the conditions of war and to figure out and develop experiments for new ways of living. And those new ways of living always involve love and intimacy. And in fact, love and intimacy is like the key weapon that allows people to survive under these conditions of war. And this talk that I gave today is really, some folks may have read an article I wrote in American Anthropologist, Captivity, Kinship, and Black Masculine Care Work Under Domestic Warfare, edited by Damien Sojourner, where it's all about the role of intimacy and closeness of in the reproduction of knowledge and in the reproduction of the capacity to engage in this war. And so this talk, the wake up, is really connected to that because it's the same people who are engaged in it, right? And those forms of care work are central to how they were able to organize the wake up, and how they were able to sort of survive. And so I appreciate the question. I try to lay it out in the book, right? But yeah, so they have totally different, the two sides have totally different philosophies of war. One is about extraction, and the other is about experimenting with new ways of being. And so, and love and intimacy, as I said, are central to that latter form of struggle.
Thank you for that. We have two questions remaining in the Q&A from Amaka and Alex. And I'm gonna ask Alex questions first and then come back to Amaka's because I believe it follow-ups nicely to the previous question from Jared. Alex Pena asked, thanks so much for your talks, how they start off their question. So inspiring in terms of the theoretical innovating you're doing as an example of radical praxis. I noticed that you briefly mentioned the significance of care networks in and out of prison. Can you talk a bit more about how you see affective labor, which is often explicitly gendered, figuring into carceral resistance?
Yeah, yeah. So this is similar to what I was just saying. So it is gendered. Yes, it's hard. It's complicated, and this is stuff that my thinking on this is constantly changing because I'm constantly learning from people that I'm engaged in. But essentially, the argument I make in the Black masculine care work under domestic war piece is that, the prison is a form of domestic war in these different ways, right? It's domestic in the sense that it's happening within US borders. It's domestic in the sense that it's a war against Black family, which I'm not mobilizing in a heteronormative sense. I'm saying that it's a war against the very possibility of Black collective life in different forms throughout history. And it's also domestic war in the sense that its aim is to domesticate incarcerated people, incarcerated Black people, and incarcerated Black men in particular. And this is what they will say. And so those cages, the cages that they forced incarcerated people to build, they're called kennels. They're organized under a behavior modification sort of regime, which I could go on and on about, but I won't, because that's not the point. But the domestication, the aim of it is to fundamentally change you on the inside, to kill you on the inside. And what incarcerated, thinkers and organizers have been saying is that it's actually, they're trying to create a form of auto genocide. They're trying to kill you on the inside so that you then go out of prison and reproduce similar forms of violence against people who are closest to you, your loved ones, your family members, your friends, people in your community. They're saying the prison is actually doing that to people actively as part of a broader genocidal process. That's how they're theorizing what the prison is doing. So under those conditions, intimacy and care become forms of rebellion against this strategy of auto-genocide, which tries to kill people inside. So incarcerated people, and I mostly am doing research with incarcerated people who are in men's prisons. The ones who are politically developed and who have really tried to cultivate a sense of like inner strength and discipline. What I have found is that they're also extremely caring people, emotionally and affectively, in terms of, asking about people's health, talking about family. I've got a whole bunch of brothers that I'm in contact with who are elders and who you know, their loved ones, their wives and girlfriends held them down while they were in prison, and now they're out. And those women now, some of them have ailing health. And so they're all, whenever I talk to some of these brothers, like they're always caring for their wife, taking them to the hospital, or, you know, I interview people in hospitals sometimes because that's where they are caring for people, right? And so these strategies of care become prerequisites for survival amid a structure that's trying to kill people inside, preserve the body but kill them inside, so that they can then just be again, these raw materials that can be deployed in different ways that are advantageous for the state. But I try to detail that in the article, so if folks are interested, you can look that up. But thanks for the question.
All right, thank you very much for that great response. And I think we have time for about 2 more questions. So the first of those 2 questions comes from someone who we both also know pretty well, is Amaka Okechukwu. And Amaka writes, this is a 2-parter. So part A is, can you speak to recent prison struggles, thinking pandemic and beyond, and administrative reaction to them? And then B is, what lessons/advice do you have for research concerning prisons and the carceral state?
Word. Thank you so much, Amaka. Recent prison struggles and administrative reactions. You know, I have to be honest, I'm not the expert on that. You know, this project has consumed me in several ways, and you know, I've developed this network of people that I'm now in touch with, and so much of my work has been to like nurture those relationships, to like finish this book, and to raise my children, frankly. And so I haven't been keeping up to date to the extent that I would like on all of the struggles that are happening. And part of why that is because there are so many contemporary struggles happening everywhere, which I think is really a sign of something, because, you know, one of the insights about the prison struggles of the past are that, you know, the prison wall is really just a physical boundary, but the inside and outside are linked. And the forms of political consciousness that are emerging outside are also emerging inside, and there's this flow back and forth. So the fact that like prison struggles are erupting in different ways in the forms of strikes and protests and rebellions, you know, I'm thinking all the way back to, you know, the struggle in Pelican Bay, and what was that 2013? I can't remember. Yeah. There has been a lot, right? So one thing is just the volume of it. The other thing that is interesting is that one of the consequences of Attica is that prison administrators have become much more adept at managing public perception. And so there's that. You know, we don't actually hear about a lot of what happens, or a lot of what we learn about is disinformation. And then I guess lastly, I'll just say one of the other things that's interesting is just the shifting role of technology in these struggles, right? And so when I'm writing, what I'm writing about, letters are like a key technology of communication on the inside and outside. Now it's cell phones, right? And prison administrators have these like cell phone trackers that they are using. There's also these tablets, which is another complicated form of struggle that's happening. So there's a lot going on, and you know, my hope was really for the book was to clearly lay out this paradigm of war, in the hopes that it will help clarify and help people who are writing about prisons in the present to not fall into the same traps of basically repeating propaganda. I mean, and I'm arguing that the reason why we don't know that prisons are war is because the propaganda efforts of these Prisoncrats have been largely successful and has found its way into academic research, right? So my advice would be to take the war analytics seriously, because the people who were responsible for constructing prisons, not only in the material sense, but also in the programmatic sense, took war seriously. So that would be my advice at this moment. I hope that was somewhat helpful.
All right, so we have one last question that we can get to. And thank you to Anthony Williams, who put it in the chat, in particular for people who want to follow up about the questions, or they have questions regarding affective labor and masculinity and gender, that Dr. Burton was interviewed by Millennials Are Killing Capitalism and discussed many of these issues there. So if you get a chance to check out that podcast interview, it's a fantastic episode. The last question that we have time for today comes from our own Yusuf Abelushi. And Yusuf writes, thanks for a fantastic talk. Ori, you explained how Dubois tracks the white revisionist response to the moment of emancipation in effect nullifying the supposed end of slavery. And you explain how this counterinsurgency let's see, I'm sorry, I lost my place, ran well into past the half century through a primarily Black and Latinx incarcerated population on the one hand, and a primarily white working class set of prison employees from the deindustrialized countryside. Craig and Ruthie's work also traces the possibilities for interracial solidarity between these two groups, especially in California prison towns. So I'm wondering what you think about the prospects of such solidarity today between the largely white prison employees and the families they come from, the towns that prisons are built in, and the largely Black and brown incarcerated people inside the prison. And what lessons can we draw from Black Reconstruction about the possibilities and challenges facing political projects for solidarity across the fractures of race and class?
Yeah, thank you, Yusuf. I mean, that's the question, really. You know, it's interesting. You know, part of the way I've been thinking about it is that, and I think incarcerated people are better situated, and I guess Du Bois talks about this too, that incarcerated people have a clearer sense of what solidarity can do politically than guards, who are in many ways held back by racist ideologies that are being nurtured by the prison itself, right? You know, sometimes I show a slide, and I wish I had it to show, of Clinton Prison in Dannemora, which is Dannemora is a prison town in upstate New York near the Canadian border. And when you go there, it's like the town is just extremely run down. And the prison is at the center of the town. It's one of the biggest prisons in New York. It's one of the most racist and repressive prisons in New York. And part of that culture is that the people who work in that prison, you know, live nearby, and you know, there's been multiple generations of people who work there, right? So you've got some people who work there whose grandfathers and great grandfathers worked there. And if you're from Dannemora, you know, that used to be, I believe, a mill town, and the mill closed. And so now the prison is the only industry there, right? And so the people who work at that prison, you know, their survival depends on this steady flow of incarcerated people. And because of how racial criminalization works, most of the people who end up in the prison are Black and Latinx, right? Which reproduces this idea, which reproduces racist ideology, right? So the prison is producing racism in this instance. But then you think about, like, the people who end up working in the prison, you know, I mean, I can't pretend to, be able to get inside of their heads, but, it's hard for me to imagine that that is something that people would want to do if they could choose to do something else, right? So they have a kind of lack of autonomy, they're living in a kind of carceral world of their own, where the only way that they can survive is to work in a prison, which is not a high status job, even though it's unionized and has decent labor, right? So the same political and economic forces that are producing this constant stream of Black incarcerated human beings that are being warehoused, those are the same forces that are making it such that a white person who lives in Dannemora has few options but to work in a prison. And so that always strikes me as a potential for solidarity, but then we have to contend with the fact that, like, Dannemora has always been an intensely racist place. And that racist ideology prevents possibilities of solidarity. It just does. I mean, I've experienced racism just as a visitor in Dannemora and walking around that town. So I don't know. The possibility is there. How one actualizes it under these actual conditions. I mean, things are getting worse up there too. So yeah, I'm not sure. And I don't know if I don't remember the second part of the question.
All right, so the second part question is, and what lessons can we draw from Black Reconstruction about the possibilities and challenges facing political projects for solidarity across the fractures of race and class, which sort of allude to what you're pointing at.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to go back to the war analytic, because Du Bois is very clear that what's happening after the Civil War is a counter-revolution, right? And so the war analytic and the stuff I was saying earlier about reform, this needs to be anticipated, right? And I think that's sort of the lesson, is that, and I think the primary strategy often is not naked repression, at least outside of prison walls, because naked repression can intensify resistance. And so the primary counter-revolutionary strategy are these reforms, which are designed to appear to meet people's demands without ceding any power. And so I think that just that understanding of how counter-revolutionary warfare operates through reform needs to kind of be internalized. And I think we need to reshape our discourse around what reform is and what its function is. And I think also, like, for me, one of the primary insights of Du Bois's work, but also of the work that I'm doing here, is that answers to questions about lessons, the good answers, don't come from professors. Like, part of what I am trying to analyze the past and, like, to help tell narratives to clarify our present condition, but, like, the intellectuals who did the intellectual labor and who were analyzing this in real time, these were ordinary people who were the ones that were most targeted by these conditions of war, right? It wasn't the professors who were on the front lines answering and coming up with solutions and recipes and plans for these problems. So one of the lessons then would be to look to people who are really engaged in the cutting edge of struggle and look at not only what they're saying, but what they're doing through their praxis, and figure out how we can support them and what we're willing to sacrifice, really, to support them. That to me is a key lesson, a key question, a key contradiction for us all to grapple with.
All right, Dr. Burton, thank you very much. We could keep you here all afternoon, evening, and night, but that would not be very kind of us at all. So in closing, want to say on behalf of the Black Reconstruction as a Portal collective, thank you very much for your time, energy, effort, work, scholarship, and all that you do. And as a reminder to everybody, please visit Black Reconstruction as a portal.org, and you can check out this lecture, which will be posted probably in a week or two, as well as previous lectures, talks, and discussions that have taken place throughout the year-long seminar as well. And you can also find information about upcoming events that will take place, and that's Black Reconstruction as a portal.org. Thank you very much for everybody who spent your morning, afternoon, evening, night, depending where you are with us. And we look forward to seeing you again at our next event. So thank you again, Dr. Burton.
Thank you. Peace.